To start with, I need to say I am honored to be here and getting the ability to speak to you all. My name is Hilde Guddingsmo. I live in Namsos, a small town with 15,000 inhabitants in Norway, an elongated country far up north, and work as an associate professor at Nord University, as a social researcher and pedagogue. As social researcher, I have explored how people with intellectual disabilities experience their own self-determination when living in group homes. As a pedagogue, I teach social educator students at the university. And this speech is about the intersection between these two areas, from working on applying findings from my research over to the arena of professional training in theater non-stop, trying to find pedagogic strategies to ensure human rights. But since this assembly is both international and interdisciplinary, I need to provide some context. I start with learning disabilities, here illustrated by the first stock picture coming up when searching the topic. But defining intellectual disability isn't actually straightforward, because it depends on which model who is used to define disability in itself. One often operates with three different understandings of disability: a medical, a social, and a relational. With a medical definition, the person must have a significant limitation in intellectual functioning, with a measured IQ below some value that actually varies a bit, and a limitation in social maturity and adaptability. It is common, then, to grade the disability according to a scale. From this, one previously used the term mental age, which unfortunately contributed to people with intellectual disabilities mistakenly being perceived as children, which they're not. So, the problem with this traditional and highly dominant definition is that it is based on the individual's impairment or diagnosis, which makes the disability a static and individual problem, which it isn't. Since the problems one have might vary quite much between contexts. So from this, there is a protest definition, the social understanding of disability, where one rather thinks that the problem is triggered by disabling barriers in society and the surroundings, and thus can be solved by making adjustments in the context through universal design. Hence, intellectual disability also becomes a socially constructed phenomenon, which includes the stigma that accompanies the situation of having or be framed within the diagnosis. But the social model is also criticized for failing to take into account the challenges that follow from having a cognitive impairment that is very real. People with intellectual disabilities have challenges with learning, understanding, or remembering things, and overlooking this is also a form of discrimination. That is why I and many others, like the United Nations, prefer the relational model that combines a social and a medical definition. Then, the disability is seen as the gap between the individual's prerequisites and the demands of society. Therefore, efforts should be made to facilitate and promote changes at both levels, for the individuals and in the structure, in order to reduce this gap together. Considering pedagogy, this is important because the discourses give different definitions to what the problem consists of, what is to be learned or changed through the pedagogical facilitation, for example, when helping to ensure the right to self-determination. People with intellectual disabilities have the same right to decide in their own lives as everyone else. The right to self-determination is enshrined in a 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where the right to freedom is considered fundamental to human dignity. For people with intellectual disabilities, however, the right is fortified with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, from 2006, which states that one cannot discriminate on the basis of disabilities and that lack of facilitation must also be understood as discrimination. With the Convention, the very understanding of self-determination changes from being about individual autonomy to becoming a relational concept as something that is both exercised and realized in interaction with others and can be promoted through relational facilitation. The right to self-determination deals with small and large decisions, the general realization of preferences, both silent and stated desires, and includes being able to make so-called bad decisions. Thus, self-determination is a right, but also a capacity, from knowing your will and being able to express it. From this, self-determination can be turned equally to empowerment. A group home is the most common living arrangement for persons with intellectual disability in Norway. They are expected to replace the traditional institutions and mostly consists of 4 to 10 cluster-organized apartments around a staff's hub. The idea is that these homes should be ordinary private homes, where the residents get help from staff based on the needs to live meaningful, independent, and self-determined lives. The helpers in this context are often the social educators, whom I teach in a 3-year bachelor program at the university. The profession is a distinctively Norwegian hybrid between nurse and social worker, and are supposed to offer such an empowering facilitative relation to realize the residents' rights to self-determination. But what does this look like in practice? This question was the background for my PhD study in social work, where I explored how persons with intellectual disabilities experience their own self-determination when living in group homes, through individual interviews and processes with method development in creative workshops, to see if working in groups with theater-based approaches could improve participation and activate a marginalized voice. My own research has been conducted in a Norwegian context, but the findings are relatively similar internationally when the contexts are otherwise comparable. The right to self-determination has not been satisfactorily realized for persons with intellectual disabilities, because despite good intentions, the group homes tend to have institutionalized features where the residents are dependent on the values and attitudes of their helpers. In my material, this culminates in how the research participants say that the house decides. Emma is one of the research participants, explaining the rules for whether her boyfriend can spend the night at her place. Then I will have to ask the house, she says. Could the house say no then? I reply. Yes, says Emma. It happens, it does. Oddbjørn, my co-researcher, laughs at me. Nah, it's a bit odd then. Could the house say no? I laugh. Everyone laughs. That would have been quite peculiar then, one of the other participants says. Yes, says Oddbjørn, that would have been peculiar. But still, the participants tended to refer to the group home as the house, as if it was a separate organism, with the authority to both provide help and permissions. On closer inspection, however, it was the staff who were in power, whereupon the participants defined their own self-determination as things they had permission to decide when the staff had decided that they were allowed to decide something for themselves. Here, Emma describes being granted to make her own decision from the staff member about spending the night with her boyfriend. She said to me, "You decide yourself." Who said that? I reply. My primary contact said that, Emma replies. You could decide that yourself, she said. How did it feel deciding yourself? I ask. Good, says Emma. One of the other participants shoots in. Then you're lucky, getting to decide that yourself. Emma states, we could decide it ourselves if we wanted to or not. It feels good getting to decide something for oneself. But this choice isn't actually free, because the criterion for being granted such self-determination was whether residents were going to make the decision the staff perceived as right. Thus, they had few other options than to be good by adapting to the norms of the house. This put the residents in an unfortunate position, because they needed to perform themselves as well-functioning and well-adjusted to be recognized as autonomous persons. In this way, self-determination wasn't perceived as a human right, but rather a gift assigned by the staff based on criteria defined by others. And the staff, who were actually supposed to offer empowering relations, became gatekeepers with the power to realize, but also withhold the residents' power towards own lives. Looking at this quote, however, I often wonder if this actual staff member is somehow trying to explain to Emma that deciding herself is her actual right. But Emma and her co-participant still perceives it as a situated permission from what they are used to. The participants took it for granted that the staff could decide over them. And people who live in institution-like environments like the house tend to do so. They develop a client identity where they embrace the notion that staff knows best. At the same time, something extra happens to life when one incurs the label intellectual disability. Goodley points out that people with intellectual disabilities must show that they are much more normal than others in order to be perceived within the normality. Thereby, it becomes difficult to disagree with the staff, because a protest so easily can be explained away as coming from someone who doesn't know better. Stoljar and Mackenzie speaks of the socialization problem. For how can one know whether the will is one's own when it is socialized from oppressive environments? Paulo Freire refers to the same thing with his culture of silence, where one does not come to know one's own rights or realizes that oppression takes place because no one ever speaks about it. Thus, a naive consciousness develops in which the person internalizes the oppressor's truth about themselves as their own, as if it was a law of nature. Freire would state that realizing the right to self-determination would demand structural changes within the group homes. However, the individuals would also need to enhance their capacity to self-determination, which Freire would term as going through a conscientization process to develop own critical awareness towards the situation in order to criticize the status quo and demand real freedom. At the same time, realizing the right to freedom is not an individual matter, because this will depend on the helping relationships for most people with intellectual disabilities. Thus, the realization of the right to self-determination depends on pedagogical practice on two fronts. Number one, in the person with intellectual disabilities, who must develop knowledge of their own rights and the ongoing oppression in order to discover their own will and learn to express it. And number two, towards the helpers, who have to move from being gatekeepers to becoming facilitators. But based on the knowledge we already have, what kind of pedagogy promotes such self-determination? The mechanisms in the house are reminiscent of what Freire referred to as banking pedagogy, from being characterized by predefined answers over which the learner has very little power to know other than just internalize. Such a type of pedagogy promotes resignation and discipline rather than independent thinking, according to him. And traditionally, there has been a tendency for people with intellectual disabilities to be exposed to behavioristic approaches to a greater extent than others, based on a medical understanding of disability, with extensive use of external goal orientation and reinforcement in order for the individual to develop skills or behavior to become more normal. And I am not claiming that these are never important methods to help people develop basic skills in order to cope as much as possible to, in example, participate in social communities. But this type of conditioning does not promote the independent thinking required to know and assert one's own free will. This requires pedagogical thinking where the answers aren't fixed, but rather open to the individual's exploration and definition of own problems. Through his pragmatic view of knowledge, John Dewey promoted precisely such a type of pedagogy in which the learning participants' own experience needs was what got to define what kind of knowledge was important. Thus, Learning was allowed to happen through experimentation, driven by the motivation to solving own experienced and thereby defined problems. To persons with learning disabilities living in group homes, such an approach can open the gates towards defining the conceptual framework for one's own preferences, desires, and values. But then we have also come to the very core of this post, because those who will facilitate this learning process are the social educators whom I educate. And in this respect, they need to be trained in the practice of this type of pedagogy. And the optimal way of doing this must be in the same way, through the exploration of self-experienced issues. However, it might not be the case that the students experience the same problems as the residents, since they often enter the social educator program already trained to be gatekeepers, because they very often have worked for a few years in a group home before starting their education. Thus, many of them will have to change their own understanding of their professional role from representing a system possessing the right values and answers to becoming a facilitative dialogue partner who promotes the other's ability to find the answers that are right to them. But thus, we as educational program are also faced with a dilemma, in that we want to teach students a pedagogy that opens up the scope for finding their own answers through a pedagogy that promotes the same, on the basis that they will develop a professional role based on a set of values that have already been given. And our experience in the program indicates that the students often find that the knowledge we are trying to convey is not internalized as their own. So they are often left with the impression that there is a difference between theory and practice. Then it becomes an interesting question whether it can alleviate this challenge, that students and people with intellectual disabilities learn by participating in co-creative arenas, by creating artistic productions together. This is the background for my current research, where I focus on whether art-based strategies in co-creative processes can solve some of this problem through exploring work processes in Theatre Nonstop. Theatre Nonstop is an ensemble for 15 actors with intellectual disability, operating within the framework of disability arts. The theatre was established already in 2008 and is run by a professional choreographer as a practice arena for 6 to 8 social educator students each year. They work on making art productions through co-creative processes using structured improvisation based on rather undefined and somewhat ephemeral ideas. Like this. What did I say that time then? Line, the art director, says. I explain. You said something like, I don't know what we're going to do, but there will be a Christmas show, and I have such an idea. I envision an image of a fur coat. Line laughed at this. But some preliminary findings from my current research exploring Theatre Nonstop's work forms is how they represent a striking contrast to the fixed answers of or definitions of the house. I will give some examples. I have always been fascinated by getting things out of individuals, Line says. That everything should be owned and personal before it comes out in some expression. A process that goes on all the way until we finish the product, We don't know what happens through the process, right? I'm open to anything they come up with. Some nuggets or something that we can work on. Or we get a new idea based on what they create. The production or what we're working on is constantly in that kind of flow, where one thing leads to something else based on what they come up with. It could be a sentence in a text they've prepared. And somehow, then, where some symbolism emerges, for example, then, I imagine something in the form of movement then, or physical theater, something that we can work specifically with and explore. The descriptions are based on a fundamental attitude where what is created is based on a completely different openness to what the individual have to bring to the table than what is the case in the gatekeeper attitude of the house. This is also manifested down to different recognition of what may be an expression of someone's preferences or will. I've been working on something and that person might not have been that into exactly that, but suddenly that person pulls towards the band. As a dancer, it is probably very logical for Lina to understand purely bodily movements as communication in line with the verbally spoken. But that isn't necessarily the case elsewhere, when non-verbal expressions are termed as behavior and not necessarily perceived to communicate anything. Simultaneously, her working method shows that she recognizes that reality is relational and that the need for helping relationship should not discriminate from having one's perspectives acknowledged. So the question is then, whether this different attitude will also affect the students who participate in the co-creative processes on stage as artists together with the actors. Lina describes it in any case that there is usually a change of attitude among the students who participate. I think probably at the start of the theater practice, they suppose they're there as helpers. When working creative, it could be like, I'm not doing this movement. I'm only here to make sure that she gets off the floor. But then they're not, right? They're there to be creative together. They don't always get that right away. In the theater, the actors are understood as professional artists, and students are expected to adopt the same attitude. The artistic approach is based on modern dance and jazz improvisation, where all involved artists work improvisationally in relation to each other. Therefore, the relational perspective is already inherent in the format, so that the impairment or functional variation, which is the term they use, is rather understood as a self-evident part of the individual's being in the world and artistic expression. Hence, it may look like the context of Theatre Nonstop managed to provide a space for learning processes based on extended recognition, or just providing a space where all the answers are right. The quote refers to Emma, who talks about how she can sometimes find it challenging to speak on behalf of herself, because she often gets stuck in finding the right answer. But what about when you're with your boyfriend then? I ask. When I'm with him, all the answers are right, she says. But then, true creativity is also original and authentic. So in order for people to be genuinely creative, one must provide such space that allows the artists working towards creating based on all own authentic ideas and definitions. But in continuation, it seems that since one collectively always works from the point of view of those who participate, the context also becomes universally designed in the face of the impairment as well as the stigma.